Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start just by putting on record the thanks of my constituents in Kensington and Bayswater, obviously inclusive of the wider Grenfell community, for the support across the House last week when the Grenfell Inquiry Stage 2 was launched, for the Minister and the Government for making time today and for committing to future time, and also for the Prime Minister for his statement and his heartfelt apology on behalf of the British state for what happened. I think he spoke for us all, including the Leader of the Opposition in that debate. The Grenfell legacy obviously has lots of dimensions, but one of them is building safety. So again, I would urge members to again remember that 72 victims from that fire whose legacy has to be partly fixing this crisis. After the report, there were kind of three immediate actions that the community were looking to me to advocate for in this place. Criminal prosecutions, of course, is not a matter, as you said, for discussion today, but it is important, as the Minister of Justice mentioned yesterday in questions, that we ensure that the court system is prepared for any potential decisions that come through the Metropolitan Police and CPS process, and ensure that court backlogs don't, and the complexity of any potential trials don't result in even further delays in justice. Secondly, the accountability of the companies themselves is not just about criminal investigations, it's also about their role in terms of public procurement, paying for remedial work, and so on. So we need to continue to push on that. And finally, the policy changes that we are discussing today to ensure this never happens again, because as others have said, the pace of change has been far too slow. And that pace of change is partly, as my right honourable friend from Sheffield South East said, the culture around, in particular, social housing tenants and how they're treated and their agency and power and respect, but also the tens of thousands of people up and down the country who are still going to bed in buildings that are unsafe. In my constituency, quite incredibly, given the history of Grenfell, we have one of those buildings that is not yet on the department's list because they went under a fire inspection just a few months ago and flammable rendering was found. And I think it's a good example of what many members have already mentioned. It's a building that has approximately 50% social tenants and 50% shared ownership leaseholders who have scraped together the money to get on the housing ladder and have now been hit with a £400 a month increase in their service charge, primarily driven by the dramatic increase in insurance after the fire inspection took place. So I agree with the Shadow Minister and his call to look at the insurance market, because in this case there was not a competitive bid for insuring this building. I know there has been a discussion with the Association of British Insurers to see how we can bring down the costs, but I would really urge the government to look at that, because in the short term, while we wait for the remedial work to take place, that is simply unaffordable for those leaseholders. So I certainly think the insurance industry is something we need to look at. In addition, this building is another example of this merry-go-round of buck passing that we talked about last week between local government, national government, developers, freeholders, housing associations. So we need clear timelines to speed this up, and I really welcome the Prime Minister's commitment on that, and incentives, I think, in the system, carrots and sticks, to make sure that we don't have this kind of never-ending situation where leaseholders and tenants are unclear about when the work will be done. And as the Minister said, the money is there, so it's about knocking heads together and making sure that at an individual building level we get the speeding up that we need. And I will be writing to her about this specific building that I've mentioned. Speeding up this work is obviously part of the answer, but there are recommendations now from Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the Grenfell Inquiry that are obviously also relevant beyond cladding itself, as the Honourable Lady mentioned. So I really welcome the announcement last week from the government that residential personalised emergency evacuation plans for disabled people will be taken forward. I know it was a big frustration of many of my constituents that had not happened under the previous government. So we look forward to more detail around what those PEEPs will look like, and I would urge the government in the comprehensive spending review to look at funding for multiple years for implementing that for social landlords, and a scheme to make sure that developers and freeholders will cover the costs for private buildings too. I think we're all still digesting the full Phase 2 report, and there will be time to go into that in more detail. But I think one recommendation that I would urge the government to think about straight away is the streamlining of accountability in terms of the ministerial responsibility and the regulator, so that we do not have a dispersed system between multiple departments that makes it very easy for things to fall through the cracks, as Sir Martin Morbick made clear in his report. So I hope we'll have time to discuss that in detail. And finally, in terms of who should pay, I really welcome the Prime Minister's statement that he will be writing to the companies and looking at exclusions in the public procurement process to ensure that companies referenced in the Grenfell report will not be able to access public tenders. And I would also want to put on record my thanks to golfer Shane Lowry, who yesterday, belatedly, but he got there in the end, removed the sponsorship from one of those companies mentioned, which I will not mention them by name, just out of caution. But more broadly, clearly these developers need to pay for the remedial work. So in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the campaigners have done an incredible job, as the Minister said in her opening remarks. Their ask has always been for truth, which we have now from the inquiry, for justice that we hope will come from the criminal prosecution system, and for change, which is on all of us to deliver in this House. Thank you.